People like you should stay quiet and clean. The words cut through the 42nd floor boardroom with the sharpness of broken glass, and for a moment, even the clicking keyboards stopped. Maya Brooks froze beside the marble conference table, one hand still wrapped around the silver handle of her cleaning cart, the faint scent of lemon polish lingering in the chilled air. Around her, 12 executives in dark tailored suits avoided eye contact the way wealthy people often did when someone beneath them became the center of humiliation. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Manhattan shimmered beneath a gray November sky, rain streaking across the glass in crooked lines while yellow taxis crawled 38 stories below like tiny moving sparks. Charles Whitman stood at the head of the table, tall, silver-haired, his navy suit pressed so perfectly it looked untouched by human hands. In front of him rested a contract thick enough to decide the future of half the city's financial district. $400 million. That was the number everyone kept whispering since sunrise. And Maya, dressed in a charcoal housekeeping uniform with rolled sleeves and faded black sneakers, was apparently ruining the atmosphere simply by existing too loudly. "Sir, I was only trying to wipe the coffee before it stained the document," she said softly, lowering her eyes without lowering her dignity. Charles let out a humorless chuckle while adjusting the cufflinks on his wrist. "Trust me," he replied, loud enough for the room to hear, "the people making real decisions here can handle paper without housekeeping assistance." A few nervous laughs spread around the table. Not cruel. Worse. Polite. Controlled. The kind rich people used when they wanted to distance themselves from discomfort without appearing heartless. Maya nodded once and stepped back, her cartwheels squeaking faintly against the polished floor. But as she reached for the cleaning cloth tucked into her apron pocket, her eyes drifted toward the open contract near Charles's hand. One sentence. Just one. Buried halfway through page 87 beneath dense legal language most people would skim past after. Midnight. Her breathing slowed. Victor Hale, the outside investor seated across from Charles, noticed the shift in her expression immediately. His expensive smile tightened almost invisibly before he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. "Everything all right over there?" he asked smoothly. Maya looked away at once. "Yes, sir." But her pulse had already changed. 5 years earlier, before debt collectors, hospital bills, and long overnight shifts, Maya Brooks used to sit in rooms exactly like this one. Different city. Different clothes. Different life. She used to build risk projections for firms that trusted her instincts enough to pay 6 figures before she turned 30. Then came the whistleblower report. The fraud case. The investigation nobody wanted connected to a black woman analyst who refused to stay quiet. By the time the lawsuits ended, the industry doors had quietly closed in her face one after another. Now she cleaned fingerprints off glass walls while men half as capable discussed markets using words they barely understood. Charles uncapped his fountain pen slowly, the room tightening around the sound. "Gentlemen," he announced, "let's finish this." Victor smiled wider. Several executives straightened in anticipation. Maya's fingers curled around the damp cloth in her hand. Her instincts screamed at her the same way they once had before every corporate collapse she'd predicted years too early for anyone powerful to listen. Then Charles lowered the pen toward the final signature line, and Maya heard herself speak before fear could stop her. "Sir," she said quietly, but the silence in the room carried her voice farther than shouting ever could, "if you sign that deal right now, Whitman Group won't belong to you by next winter." The boardroom fell into the kind of silence that made every small sound feel dangerous. Rain tapped softly against the towering windows. Somewhere near the back wall, an ice cube cracked inside a glass of bourbon. Charles Whitman slowly lifted his pen away from the paper, his pale blue eyes narrowing as they settled on Maya Brooks like he was seeing her clearly for the first time and already disliking what he saw. Victor Hale leaned back in his leather chair, though the confidence in his posture had shifted ever so slightly. "Excuse me?" Charles asked, his voice calm enough to make several executives immediately nervous. Maya swallowed once. Her hands remained steady around the folded cleaning cloth, but her heartbeat pressed heavily against her ribs beneath the thin gray fabric of her uniform. "The voting rights clause on page 87, she said carefully. "It transfers temporary emergency authority to outside stakeholders after 6 months of declining performance. The language sounds protective, but it is not. If market pressure is triggered intentionally, Whitman Group loses operational control." A younger executive frowned and flipped through the contract quickly. Another reached for his reading glasses. Victor gave a low chuckle meant to dissolve the tension. "Charles, surely we are not pausing a $400 million acquisition because someone from housekeeping misunderstood legal terminology." A few people smiled weakly, grateful for permission to relax again. But Maya did not look at Victor. She kept her eyes on Charles because she recognized something dangerous in men like him. Pride mattered more to them than truth. "I did not misunderstand it," she said softly. "The wording is designed to delay the consequences until after the transition period." Charles stared at her for another long second before standing slowly from his chair. At 6'3", he seemed even taller beneath the recessed ceiling lights, the city skyline glowing silver behind him. "What exactly makes you believe you are qualified to interrupt this meeting?" he asked. The question landed harder than shouting would have. Maya felt every eye in the room settle onto her skin, onto her name badge, onto the housekeeping cart beside her like it proved something about her worth. She lowered her gaze briefly. Not in shame. In restraint. "Nothing, sir," she answered. "I just know what that clause does." Victor smirked openly now. "There it is," he said. "Confidence without comprehension. That is the problem with people who spend too much time online reading conspiracy theories." Several executives laughed louder this time. Charles did not. He walked around the table slowly until he stood only a few feet from Maya. The expensive scent of cedar and cologne lingered around him, sharp against the sterile smell of floor polish. "How long have you worked here?" he asked. 5 years. "And in 5 years," Charles continued, "did anyone ever give you the impression that cleaning conference rooms made you part of corporate strategy?" Maya felt heat rise beneath her collar, but her voice stayed level. "No, sir." "Good," he replied. "Then let us avoid confusion moving forward." He reached past her, grabbed the folded cloth from her hand, and placed it firmly back onto the edge of the cart. Not violent. Somehow worse. Deliberate. Dismissive. Around the room, people avoided looking at her directly now, as if humiliation became contagious once acknowledged. Maya nodded once and stepped backward toward the door. She could leave. She probably should leave. That was what survival looked like most days. Stay quiet. Keep the paycheck. Do not embarrass powerful men. But then one of the junior analysts near the windows spoke carefully without looking up from the contract. "Sir," he murmured, "there actually is a secondary authority provision here." Victor's expression tightened instantly. Charles turned back toward the table. And for the first time since Maya entered the room that morning, uncertainty slipped quietly into the air. Victor Hale recovered first. Men like him usually did. The smile returned to his face slowly, polished and controlled, but the tendons along his jaw had tightened beneath the warm glow of the boardroom lights. "Secondary authority provisions are standard in acquisitions," he said smoothly while adjusting the platinum watch at his wrist. "That does not mean this woman understands corporate governance." The junior analyst near the windows shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It is just that the trigger conditions seem unusually broad," he admitted quietly. Charles Whitman extended his hand without taking his eyes off the contract. "Give me the document." The analyst slid the thick stack across the marble table. Rain rolled harder. Now against the glass outside, turning Manhattan into a blur of silver lights and shadow. Maya remained near the doorway beside her cleaning cart, one hand resting lightly against the metal handle as though she were prepared to disappear the second someone ordered her to. She had spent years mastering invisibility. Wealthy people preferred service workers quiet, efficient, and forgettable. The less human you seemed, the more comfortable they became. Charles flipped slowly through the pages, the soft sound of expensive paper moving beneath his fingers filling the room. Victor crossed one leg calmly over the other. "Charles," he said with an easy laugh, "surely we are not allowing a housekeeping employee to derail months of negotiation because she skimmed legal jargon over somebody's shoulder." Maya looked down at the polished floor. Her reflection stared faintly back at her beneath the chandelier light. Tired eyes. Tight shoulders. A woman carrying too many years in silence. She remembered another conference room in Chicago nearly 7 years earlier. Different skyline. Different table. She had warned senior executives about manipulated debt exposure then too. They ignored her until federal investigators arrived 6 months later. By that point the company collapsed, pensions disappeared, and the same executives who dismissed her testimony suddenly claimed they never saw the warning signs. Maya learned something painful after that. Powerful people rarely hated being wrong as much as they hated being corrected by someone they considered beneath them. Charles stopped turning pages. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Victor noticed it instantly. "There is a problem?" Victor asked carefully. Charles did not answer right away. He reread a paragraph twice, thumb pressing hard against the paper. "This clause was not in the preliminary drafts," he said finally. The room stiffened again. Victor leaned forward with measured patience. "Minor revisions happened during final legal cleanup. Entirely routine." "Routine?" Charles repeated. His voice had lost its earlier arrogance and settled into something colder. "It transfers emergency governance authority to external investment protection officers." One of the attorneys near the far end of the table cleared his throat nervously. "Technically temporary, sir." Charles looked up sharply. "Temporary control is still control." Silence spread again. Maya could almost feel the temperature shifting inside the room. Executives who had laughed at her minutes earlier now avoided speaking altogether. Victor's smile faded by one careful inch. "Charles, if market conditions remain stable, the clause never activates." Maya spoke before she could stop herself. "Unless someone intentionally destabilizes the market position first." Every head turned toward her again. Victor's eyes hardened immediately. "That is enough," he snapped, the smoothness finally cracking in his voice. "You are making accusations you do not understand." Maya met his stare for the first time. Calm. Steady. "No," she said quietly. "I understand them very well." Charles slowly lowered the contract onto the table. The city lights behind him flickered across the storm-dark windows while thunder rolled somewhere far above the Hudson River. Then, without taking his eyes off Victor, he asked the question nobody in the room expected. "Miss Brooks," he said carefully, "where exactly did you learn to read contracts like this?" The question lingered in the room like smoke after a fire. Maya Brooks stood motionless beside the doorway while rainwater crawled down the massive windows behind Charles Whitman in slow crooked streams. Nobody moved. Nobody checked their phones anymore. Even the assistants seated near the back wall had stopped typing. Charles remained standing at the head of the marble table, one hand resting against the open contract while the other hung stiffly at his side. His eyes stayed fixed on Maya with a level of attention that felt heavier than anger. "Miss Brooks," he repeated carefully, "where did you learn this?" Maya hesitated. The fluorescent lights above reflected softly across the polished floor beneath her sneakers. For a second she looked smaller than everyone else in the room. "Not weak. Just tired. I used to work in financial risk analysis," she answered quietly. Victor Hale laughed instantly, "Too fast. Too sharp. Come on. He leaned back in his chair with a grin that invited everyone else to dismiss her with him. Now the housekeeper was secretly a Wall Street expert all along? A few uncertain smiles appeared around the table, but nobody committed fully this time. The room had changed. Maya could feel it. Charles did not laugh. "What firm?" he asked. Maya lowered her eyes briefly before answering. "Grayson and Cole Capital. Chicago." The name landed differently. One of the older board members frowned immediately. Another executive slowly looked up from his tablet. Even Victor's expression flickered for half a second before recovering. Grayson and Cole had collapsed nearly 6 years earlier after one of the biggest financial fraud investigations in Illinois history. Thousands of employees lost their jobs. Pension accounts vanished overnight. The scandal dominated national headlines for months. Charles narrowed his eyes. "You worked there before the investigation?" Maya nodded once. "I was part of the risk division." Victor folded his hands together tightly. "Charles, with respect, this is becoming absurd. We are discussing a disgraced former employee from a failed company while a $400 million agreement sits unfinished in front of us." Maya's voice remained calm. "The company failed because leadership ignored the warnings." Victor turned toward her sharply. "And I suppose you were the only genius who saw it coming?" The words carried enough contempt to make the younger staff near the windows glance down uncomfortably. Maya did not react emotionally. That almost bothered Victor more. "No," she said softly. "I was just one of the people who tried to stop it." Charles slowly walked around the table again, studying her now with something more complicated than skepticism. Outside, lightning flashed faintly behind the clouds, silver light briefly illuminating the sharp lines of the skyline beyond the glass. "Why are you cleaning offices if you had that kind of career?" he asked. The question sounded less cruel than before. More honest. Maya took a slow breath. "Because after the investigation, nobody wanted to hire the black analyst who testified against senior executives." Silence again. Heavy this time. One of the attorneys quietly removed his glasses. Another shifted in his seat as though suddenly uncomfortable inside his own expensive suit. Victor scoffed. "People lose jobs every day. That does not make her qualified to accuse my firm of manipulation." Maya finally looked directly at him. "Then let your legal team explain why the clause only activates after market destabilization triggered by external investor review." Victor's jaw tightened. Charles noticed immediately. The billionaire turned slowly toward the attorneys seated near the center of the table. "Can they explain it?" Nobody answered right away. One lawyer flipped nervously through the pages. Another loosened his tie slightly. The silence stretched too long. Then the boardroom doors opened unexpectedly. Several heads turned as Evelyn Whitman stepped inside carrying a thin black folder against her chest. Her dark coat was still damp from the rain outside, strands of chestnut hair clinging lightly near her collar. She stopped the moment she sensed the tension in the room. "Dad," she asked carefully. Charles did not look away from Victor. "Perfect timing," he said coldly. "Apparently the only person warning us about this deal tonight is the woman everyone here thought was only hired to clean the floors." Evelyn Whitman stepped farther into the boardroom, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor while every pair of eyes followed her. The black folder pressed against her chest looked ordinary, but the tension in her face was not. She glanced once at Maya standing beside the doorway, then toward the open contract resting near her father's hand. "What is happening?" Evelyn asked quietly. Charles exhaled slowly through his nose, the muscles in his jaw rigid beneath the pale light overhead. "Apparently," he said, "Ms. Brooks believes Victor's agreement transfers control of the company if market conditions shift." Evelyn's expression changed instantly. Not shock. Recognition. Victor noticed it too. "Evelyn, he said smoothly, surely you are not entertaining this nonsense. But she did not answer him. Her eyes stayed fixed on Maya. You saw it too, she asked softly. The room froze all over again. Charles turned toward his daughter sharply. What do you mean, too? Evelyn hesitated, then slowly walked to the conference table. Raindrops still clung to the sleeve of her dark wool coat. Last night, she admitted carefully, I asked Maya to review the draft projections. Victor's chair scraped lightly against the floor. You what? Charles stared at her in disbelief. You brought a housekeeper into confidential negotiations? Evelyn shook her head immediately. No. I brought in someone I trusted to tell me the truth. Silence swallowed the room whole. Maya lowered her eyes, uncomfortable beneath the sudden attention, but Evelyn continued before anyone could interrupt. 3 days ago the numbers stopped making sense, she explained. The debt protection ratios were too clean. Too perfect. I thought maybe I was missing something. She slowly placed the black folder onto the marble table. Maya found the issue in under 20 minutes. Victor laughed again, but the confidence was gone now. This is unbelievable. He looked around the room as though searching for support. We are seriously allowing corporate decisions to be influenced by hallway gossip and amateur analysis? Charles opened the folder without responding. Inside sat page after page of handwritten notes, highlighted clauses, market projections, and margin calculations written in precise clean handwriting. Maya's handwriting. Charles flipped through the pages slowly. The deeper he read, the quieter the room became. She mapped the trigger chain, Evelyn said softly. Every scenario. Every pressure point. If outside investors manipulate short-term valuation declines, the emergency governance clause activates automatically. One of the attorneys leaned closer toward the papers. These projections are detailed, he murmured almost involuntarily. Another executive adjusted his glasses. Too detailed to be random. Victor's composure finally cracked. Enough, he snapped, rising from his chair. Charles, this entire thing is absurd. You are humiliating your own partners because of accusations from a former analyst who now cleans office floors. The words hung ugly in the air. Maya remained still beside the doorway, but Charles noticed something then that unsettled him more than anger would have. She looked embarrassed for him. Not herself. Him. As though she had seen powerful men destroy themselves this way before. Charles closed the folder slowly. Sit down, Victor. I will not sit here while my integrity is questioned by someone who pushes a cleaning cart. Sit down, Charles repeated, colder this time. Victor stayed standing. The city lights flickered behind him while thunder rolled again somewhere beyond the Hudson River. You are making a mistake, Victor warned. Am I? Charles asked quietly. He lifted one page from the folder and held it up beneath the boardroom lights. Because according to these calculations, if I sign your deal tonight, Whitman Group loses controlling authority in 11 months. Nobody spoke. Not even Victor. Charles turned one final page inside the folder, then suddenly stopped moving altogether. His eyes locked onto a line near the bottom. His expression hardened with something far heavier than suspicion. Slowly, he looked up at Maya. These market correction formulas, he said carefully, they were developed by Lydia Brooks. Maya's breathing caught for the first time all night. Yes, sir, she answered softly. Charles stared at her across the silent room. Lydia Brooks was your mother? The rain outside softened into a steady whisper against the glass, but inside the boardroom, nobody even seemed to breathe anymore. Maya Brooks stood frozen beside her cleaning cart while Charles Whitman remained motionless at the head of the table, the folder still open in his hands. The overhead lights reflected against the polished marble floor, casting pale gold across the wheels of the cart and the damp edges of Evelyn's coat. Victor Hale slowly sat back down without realizing he had done it, his confidence draining from his face one careful inch at a time. Charles looked at Maya differently now. Not like staff. Not like background noise. Like memory. Lydia Brooks, he repeated quietly, almost to himself. The woman who designed the adaptive market correction model after the crash of '98. Maya nodded once. Yes, sir. One of the older board members leaned back heavily in his chair. My God, he whispered. I studied her papers in graduate school. Another executive looked stunned. Her forecasting system prevented 2 pension collapses on the East Coast. Charles lowered his eyes briefly toward the handwritten formulas covering the pages in front of him. His fingers tightened around the paper. Your mother consulted for Whitman Group nearly 20 years ago, he said. Maya's expression softened with something painful and distant. I know. Charles slowly removed his glasses for the first time all evening. She was brilliant. The room stayed silent. Maya swallowed gently before answering. She was. Outside the windows, lightning flashed faintly beyond the storm clouds, illuminating the skyline in silver for half a heartbeat before darkness returned. Charles stared at her another moment, and suddenly the age in his face became more visible beneath the cold boardroom lighting. What happened to her? He asked quietly. Maya looked down at the folded cleaning cloth resting atop her cart. Cancer, she answered. 8 years ago. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Even Victor said nothing now. Maya's voice remained calm, but softer than before. When she got sick, firms stopped calling. Medical bills came faster than consulting work. By the end, she was teaching accounting classes at a community center in Chicago because nobody wanted to hire a black woman over 60 in high finance anymore. Charles lowered his gaze slowly. The words settled heavily across the room because too many people there understood exactly how true they sounded. Maya continued quietly. After she passed, I inherited her research. I kept studying it. Evelyn folded her arms tightly against herself, eyes drifting toward the pages spread across the table. That is why your analysis looked familiar, she said softly. It felt older. Smarter somehow. Maya almost smiled at that. Almost. My mother believed markets were emotional before they were mathematical, she replied. Most firms stopped believing that once greed became more profitable. Charles walked slowly toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. His reflection stared back at him through the rain-dark glass. Billionaire founder. Financial icon. A man who built skyscrapers and moved markets with a phone call. Yet standing there now, he looked strangely small beside the storm outside. I met your mother once, he said quietly without turning around. Maya blinked in surprise. At a conference in Boston. 19 years ago. He gave a faint humorless smile. She embarrassed half the room by predicting a liquidity problem nobody else noticed. A few soft, uneasy laughs moved around the table. Charles shook his head slightly. The worst part was that she turned out to be right. Silence again. Warm this time. Human. Maya looked down at her hands. Tiny traces of lemon cleaner still clung faintly to her fingertips beneath the cold air conditioning. Charles turned slowly back toward the room. His eyes drifted to the housekeeping badge clipped near Maya's collar. Then to the cleaning cart beside her. Then to the market projections that had probably just saved his company from disaster. The contrast seemed to hit him all at once. Wealth. Power. Status. Titles. All of it suddenly looked fragile beneath the fluorescent lights. Victor cleared his throat carefully, trying to reclaim control of the room. Charles, he began cautiously, perhaps we should continue this discussion privately before making assumptions based on emotional connections. Charles did not answer immediately. He simply walked back toward the table, picked up the unsigned contract, and stared at the signature line for a very long time. Then, without a word, he closed the folder completely. The sound of the folder closing echoed softly through the boardroom, and somehow that quiet noise carried more weight than shouting ever could. Charles Whitman rested both hands against the marble table, staring down at the unsigned contract while rain continued sliding across the windows behind him in silver rivers. Nobody dared interrupt the silence now. Not the executives. Not the attorneys. Not even Victor Hale. The billionaire slowly lifted the agreement again and flipped directly to the final pages. His eyes narrowed. Page 87, he murmured. Emergency governance transfer. He turned another page. Cross-market stabilization authority. Another page. External investor review activation. His jaw tightened harder with each line. Then suddenly he stopped. Wait. The word cut through the room instantly. Charles reached for the black folder Evelyn had brought and compared one set of numbers against the contract in front of him. Again. Then a third time. These projections are not estimates, he said quietly. They are mapped to live market timing windows. One of the attorneys leaned closer. What does that mean? Charles looked up slowly, pale eyes fixed directly on Victor. It means somebody already planned the destabilization sequence before this deal was signed. The room turned cold. Victor gave a slow disbelieving laugh. Charles, you are spiraling into paranoia because a former analyst made dramatic assumptions. Am I? Charles slid one page across the table toward the legal team. Then explain why the market correction dates in Maya's analysis align with your offshore acquisition schedule. Silence. One attorney adjusted his tie nervously. Another began typing rapidly on a laptop. Across the room, Evelyn stared at Victor with growing disbelief. You scheduled secondary asset withdrawals before the transition period even begins, she said quietly. Victor's calm expression slipped for the first time all night. Barely. But enough. Charles noticed. Maya noticed too. That is standard contingency planning, Victor replied carefully. No, Maya said softly from beside the doorway. It is liquidation preparation. Victor turned toward her sharply, anger flashing across his face before he controlled it again. You have absolutely no authority to speak in this room. Maya lowered her eyes briefly, then answered with calm honesty. No, sir. I do not. That answer hit harder than defiance would have. Charles slowly removed the final signature page from the contract. The thick paper trembled faintly between his fingers, though whether from anger or realization, nobody could tell. 5 years, he said quietly without looking at Maya. 5 years you cleaned these floors while carrying all this knowledge. Maya remained still. Knowledge does not matter much once people decide what they see when they look at you. Nobody in the room had a response for that. The rain softened outside again, tapping gently against the glass while Manhattan glowed beneath the storm clouds like a city underwater. Charles looked toward the cleaning cart near the doorway. The spray bottles. The folded cloth. The rubber gloves tucked into the side compartment. Then he looked back at the pages that had probably just saved his company from collapse. Shame settled visibly across his face. Slow. Heavy. Human. Victor stood abruptly. I think this meeting is over. Charles finally looked directly at him. You are right. Victor reached for his briefcase. Good. We can reconvene once emotions settle down. No, Charles said coldly. You misunderstand me. He placed the unsigned contract flat against the marble table. Then, in one clean deliberate motion, he tore the signature page directly down the center. The sound snapped through the silent boardroom like a crack of thunder. Several executives inhaled sharply. Victor froze completely. Charles dropped the torn paper onto the table without taking his eyes off him. The deal is over. For the first time all night, Victor Hale had no polished response waiting behind his smile. Charles turned away from him slowly and faced Maya instead. The billionaire who had humiliated her barely an hour earlier now looked at her with something dangerously close to regret. "Ms. Brooks," he said quietly, "how much would Whitman Group have lost?" Maya hesitated before answering. "Everything, sir." The silence that followed felt endless. Then one of the junior analysts near the windows spoke under his breath, almost too quietly for anyone to hear. "She just saved the company." Nobody moved after the words left the analyst's mouth. "She just saved the company." The sentence lingered in the cold air beneath the recessed ceiling lights while rain continued sliding down the glass walls surrounding the 42nd floor boardroom. Victor Hale stood frozen beside his chair, his expensive briefcase hanging uselessly at his side now that the performance was over. Around the table, executives who had laughed earlier could no longer seem to look directly at Maya Brooks. Some stared at the torn contract still lying across the marble surface. Others looked at the handwritten pages spread beside it like evidence from a trial nobody expected to lose. Charles Whitman slowly sat down in his chair again, but the movement lacked the confidence it carried at the beginning of the evening. He looked older somehow. The city lights behind him reflected faintly across the silver strands in his hair while thunder rolled low across the distant skyline. Maya remained beside the doorway with one hand resting lightly against her cleaning cart. She had not stepped farther into the room even after everything changed. That detail stayed with Charles more than anything else. She still acted like she did not belong there, even after saving all of them. Victor finally cleared his throat. "Charles," he began carefully, "we can still repair this misunderstanding." Charles looked up slowly. "Misunderstanding?" The billionaire's voice stayed calm, but there was something dangerous beneath the quiet now. "You attempted to strip operational control from my company using hidden trigger clauses." Victor straightened defensively. "Every agreement contains leverage points, not criminal ones." The room went silent again. Victor opened his mouth to respond, then stopped when two members of Whitman Group's legal division quietly stood from their seats and walked toward Charles instead of him. The shift was subtle. Final. Victor noticed immediately. For the first time all night, uncertainty entered his eyes. Charles leaned back slowly in his chair, exhaustion visible beneath the polished image he wore so carefully in public. "Leave the building, Victor." "Charles." "Now." Victor's jaw tightened. He glanced once toward Maya, anger and humiliation flickering briefly across his face before he grabbed his briefcase and walked toward the exit without another word. The boardroom doors closed behind him with a soft click. Nobody spoke for several seconds after he left. The storm outside had begun fading and distant. Breaks of gold light now pushed faintly through the clouds over Manhattan. Charles stared at the torn contract on the table before finally looking toward Maya again. "Ms. Brooks," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Maya lowered her eyes slightly. "You do not owe me anything, sir." That answer hit harder than blame would have. Charles stood slowly from his chair and walked around the length of the table until he reached the cleaning cart near the doorway. The executives watched silently as one of the richest men in New York stopped beside a cart full of spray bottles and folded towels. Charles looked down at the cleaning cloth he had shoved back into Maya's hands earlier that night. Without speaking, he picked it up carefully from the top shelf of the cart. The room stayed perfectly still. He held the cloth for a moment, staring at it like it represented something far heavier than fabric and detergent. "I spent 30 years believing success meant always knowing who mattered the second they walked into a room," he said quietly. "Tonight proved I was wrong." Maya looked at him, surprised by the honesty in his voice. Charles extended the cloth toward her gently, not as an order this time, but almost like an offering. "I am sorry for the way I spoke to you." Nobody in the room had likely ever heard Charles Whitman apologize publicly before. Maya hesitated, then slowly accepted the cloth from his hand. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the fabric still warm from his grip. "Thank you, sir," she answered softly. Charles exhaled heavily and glanced around the room at the executives who suddenly looked deeply uncomfortable inside their expensive suits. Effective immediately, he announced, "I want Ms. Brooks hired as a strategic risk consultant for Whitman Group." Several heads lifted in shock. Maya blinked once. "Sir, I clean offices." Charles gave a faint tired smile. "No," he said quietly. "You saw what every expert in this room missed." Evelyn stepped closer beside her father, warmth finally returning to her expression. "You belong at the table, Maya." Maya looked around the room slowly. The marble floors. The glowing skyline. The people who spent hours pretending not to see her every day. Then she looked down at the housekeeping badge clipped against her uniform. Her voice stayed gentle when she finally spoke. "I never wanted revenge," she said. "I just wanted someone to listen before it was too late." By the time the meeting finally ended, the storm over Manhattan had already begun to break apart. Thin ribbons of early morning light stretched between the clouds outside the towering glass windows while exhausted executives gathered their papers in uneasy silence. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody ignored Maya Brooks as she stood beside her cleaning cart near the doorway. In fact, most of them could not seem to look at her for very long at all. Shame had a way of lowering wealthy eyes faster than anger ever could. Charles Whitman remained alone near the end of the marble table long after the others drifted quietly out of the boardroom. The torn pieces of the contract still rested beside his untouched fountain pen, illuminated by the pale gold light slowly creeping across the skyline. For the first time in years, the room looked less like a kingdom and more like a place where a man almost lost everything because he believed power made him impossible to deceive. Maya began quietly organizing the cleaning supplies on her cart again. Spray bottles. Folded towels. Rubber gloves. Small ordinary things. Charles watched her for a long moment before finally speaking. "You still plan to finish your shift?" Maya gave a faint tired smile without looking up. "Someone has to clean up the mess." The words were gentle, but they settled heavily in the silence between them. Charles lowered his eyes briefly. "Fair enough." Outside, the first hint of sunrise reflected across the wet streets 38 floors below, turning the rain-covered city into sheets of gold and silver. Evelyn Whitman stepped back into the room carrying 2 cups of coffee from the executive lounge downstairs. She handed one quietly to Maya first. That detail did not go unnoticed by Charles. Maya accepted it with both hands, warmth spreading into her fingers after hours beneath the cold air conditioning. "Thank you," she whispered. Evelyn leaned lightly against the edge of the table beside her father. "Human resources will prepare everything later today," she said carefully. "Consulting contract. Office access. Full reinstatement into corporate finance." Maya stared into the steam rising from the coffee cup. "I appreciate that," she answered softly. "But I need time." Charles nodded immediately. "Take whatever time you need." Another silence settled over the room, though this one no longer felt sharp. Just honest. Tired people standing in the remains of a long night. Maya slowly unclipped the housekeeping badge from the front of her uniform and looked down at it resting in her palm. 5 years of invisible work reduced to plastic and faded lettering. Charles watched quietly as she traced her thumb once across the scratched surface. "You know," he said after a moment, "my company has spent millions on leadership seminars about recognizing talent." A faint humorless smile crossed his face. "Turns out all we really needed was the ability to see people." Maya looked toward the windows where sunlight now pushed steadily through the fading storm clouds. "Most people do see," she replied softly. "They just decide too quickly what someone is worth." Charles absorbed the words slowly. There was no defense left in him now. No ego. Just understanding arriving painfully late. Down the hallway outside the boardroom, early morning staff had already begun arriving for work. Maya could hear distant vacuum cleaners humming against carpet and the soft rattle of service carts moving through the executive floor. The same sounds she heard every morning while powerful people walked past without learning her name. She slipped the housekeeping badge gently into the side pocket of her cart instead of throwing it away. Charles noticed that too. "You are keeping it?" he asked quietly. Maya nodded once. "There is no shame in honest work." The billionaire lowered his eyes for a second, humbled by the answer. Then slowly, without speaking, he reached over and opened the boardroom door for her himself. Maya paused briefly, surprised by the gesture. Sunlight spilled across the polished hallway floor beyond them, warm and bright after the long, stormy night. Employees passing by slowed in confusion when they saw Charles Whitman holding the door open for the woman they all knew as housekeeping staff. Maya stepped forward calmly, pushing the cleaning cart into the glowing hallway while morning light reflected softly against the glass walls around her. Behind her, Charles remained standing silently in the doorway, watching the woman he almost dismissed walk away carrying more dignity than anyone else in the building.